beers there. But for some reason, and I find this fascinating, any convenience store you go to, if you ask for a beer and you want it opened, they will pop that thing open for you right then and there. It, as an American, you know, where there are no open container laws or anything, it is fascinating to see. But that, of course, is definitely another webinar. That's definitely not what we'll talk about today. So thank you again for that lovely introduction. Hello from Taipei, Taiwan, to anybody that happens to be listening. I know that we had some technical issues with the original broadcast, which I do apologize about, but I am thrilled to be here talking to you about Consulting Accepted and to give you, you know, my personal experience in education consulting and what it's like to live and work in China. So to begin with a little about me and how I fell into, because I really do feel like I fell into education consulting. So like Lucy said, I am an alumnus of the college. I graduated in 2011 with a degree in political science. I self-specialized in international relations, and I wrote my thesis on the reasons and the factors behind the evolution of China's strategic weapons program. So China factored in. I definitely have not been working with nuclear weapons at all since then, but it definitely laid a nice foundation, an intellectual foundation for the work that I would end up doing. Somehow I did not include Chinese language in there. I took Japanese in college. Hindsight, of course, is 2020. It would have been very useful, but I was able to pick things up, the useful things I don't want. Please open my beer bottle, etc. So when I first graduated from the college, I began working at the Graham School. So of course, working on things like continuing education. And it's here that I started working for the Graduate Student at Large program. And for those who aren't familiar, GSAL is a non-degree program that the university offers whereby students can take actual undergraduate and graduate courses. You must have your bachelor's in order to do it, but it's an excellent way to, you know, really live that life of the mind that the university talks about, to explore new topics, new avenues, and it can be a helpful way to prepare for graduate study, prepare for a change in career. And as a first-generation college graduate, and as somebody who has a very emotional connection to the idea of learning and to the benefit that education can provide, working for a program like GSAL and working with these students who are really looking to transform their lives through education was something that was really helpful for me. And this is where I first began working with Chinese students. And many of the students that I would see were bright. They came from, you know, top universities in China. They were looking for ways to break into America and American education. However, they were lacking some key things. And the things that I saw that they were really lacking were social in nature, social and cultural in terms of how an American classroom and an American educational experience is conducted. So I began looking into these differences, and this is where I found the field of education consulting. To sort of flash forward through all of that, through informational interviewing, which thank you Career Advancement for giving me those skills, I was able to find fellow alumni who worked in the field. I was able to talk to them about their experiences, find out about specific companies, sent out some resumes, did a few interviews, and received an offer. So my story, this sort of experience, serves mostly to inform, hopefully to entertain a bit, into what I saw of the industry, of China, of entrepreneurship, and sort of the complicated ways in which all of these play together, and how they could be potentially useful for you and your own career. So at its most basic, there is the question, what is education consulting? Education consulting is the business of getting admissions offers, plain and simple. Now, for the most part, when people talk about education consulting in China, they're talking about undergraduate admissions. This is really where the bulk of students are, and frankly, this is where the money is. There are approximately, the number is ever changing, but there are approximately 300,000 Chinese students currently studying in the US. And while I unfortunately don't have a reliable number for how many of them are undergraduate, the vast majority of them are undergraduate students here attending American universities. But of course, this consulting work can also be helpful for attaining graduate admissions, high school admissions. There is a burgeoning consulting industry for high school admissions, specifically for East Coast boarding schools. And there's even this small burgeoning and growing desire for summer school admissions consulting. And this is largely growing as Chinese students become a little more aware of the idea of extracurricular activities, which I will talk a bit about later on. So within the goal of getting those admissions officers, what a consultant really does is help to bridge the gap and reduce risk. And by this I mean that that difference in culture, in classroom culture, is one of the things that consultants aim to overcome. In Chinese schools, there is a lot of rote memorization, and what the teacher says goes. There's very little room for critical inquiry and discussion, which of course is the antithesis of what we experienced at the University of Chicago, and what is more common among American schools, whether at the college level or higher or lower. And as these gaps are being bridged, the idea is reducing risk. So as I said, there are some 300,000 students from China currently studying in the US. We can break that down and get a sense for how difficult it is for them by looking at the University of Chicago's numbers. So my statistics might be a little old, but typically, if I were to generalize, the university brings in first-year classes of usually around 1,500 students. Of them, typically, or at least when I was there, roughly 10% of the student population would be international. So 10% of 1,500 will be our rough number for the number of new international students coming in at any given time. And that group may be split among as many as 100 countries. And because American universities like diversity, we may not necessarily have spoken or unspoken quotas for where we're bringing in our students, but there is definitely an eye or a sense in the very subjective way that admissions can work of building that diversity. So that means there may only be a small handful of seats that are open to Chinese students. Top schools like Chicago or Harvard or Yale may only take 1 or 2 per year. So what parents especially see as the benefit of working with a consultant is reducing the risk and making sure that these kids, their kids, can get into at least one school as part of this strenuous and really expensive process. And consulting factors into these very different types of companies. And I'll sort of talk about the ones that I worked with to show some of the variety. But really, there are global networks where a company may be based in China or based in America, and they may have consultants working remotely all over the world. There are companies that will have offices in every major city in China. There are countries that may only focus on companies that may only focus on one regional market. Or you may even find freelancers. You may find somebody who is living in China or working in a completely different industry, who may handle a couple of applications or a couple of consulting gigs on the side around their typical work. There really is, because it's very much about knowledge and process and not a lot of overhead, there are a lot of ways to engage with consulting as a field. So with all of that, what do consultants do? The basic answer is whatever needs to be done. The goal is to have those admission letters, and you do what you can do to make that happen. Now, the core services are brainstorming for essays, essay writing, interview preparation, and school choice. And usually, especially with Chinese companies, these services will be all-inclusive or comprehensive. So usually, your consultant will help you think about topics for essays, we'll proofread them, we'll ask you interview questions, we'll go over your resume, your activity list, and we'll look at your school choice and help you refine it based on your test scores. So trying to find schools that will be a good fit for you, a reach, and a couple of safeties. And within this, there is an element of strategy. So as I mentioned, you're going to try to make a school list. The consultant will make these school lists that are based on scores and things. A very good consultant will also try to get a sense of individuality out of the student. China is a place where, by American standards, not necessarily objectively, but the way in which we may look at how Chinese students measure success, we may see it as homogeneous. I would work with a lot of students who would say that their favorite subject was math. I would work with a lot of students who would say that their friends, their mom's friend's kid was reading Sherlock Holmes. And that boy or girl may have been very good in school. So suddenly all of the friends, all of the moms are being pushed to read these books. So these books will appear on book lists for the sake of the applications. pulling out individual qualities of the students, sort of miring through answers about math in the same books and things like that, is another thing that a consultant can do that a parent or a student really would not think to do. Now, teaching classes. I'll try to be very brief on teaching because consulting is not teaching. Teaching is not consulting, but consulting sometimes includes teaching. Teaching is sometimes something that consultancies do during the low season, and it's sometimes a way to help recruit students. So not every consultant teaches, but if you are able to do something like teach test prep, SAT, ACT, TOEFL, it's definitely something that can be done. In terms of other services, really the core is what the focus is. Other services usually come into play if a company is trying to be innovative. So they may do things like reading programs, something that I'll talk about in just a minute, or they may have classes, like I mentioned, just sort of to fill the downtime. Not something that's necessarily truly beneficial for the student, but will help to keep the student happy and buy time between the admission cycles. The core of all of this, though, is results. All of this really doesn't mean much unless these kids are getting those admissions letters. So results are really what the goal is, and anything that you do, anything that needs to be done is related to results. Now, related to that, this is not an industry that is considered to be squeaky clean by many who know much about it. You can Google stories in the New York Times and learn or read about ways in which there are shady companies with shady dealings. There may be backdoor deals between shady consultancies and lower tier schools. There may be questions of cheating. There may be questions of plagiarism. In fact, one of the companies I worked for that is considered to be generally one of the cleaner companies by American standards. Again, this is very much, not an objective moral criticism, but sort of looking at the process from an American perspective and the way that we perceive admissions to be compared to what is going on in China and the perception in China. You can find New York Times articles about the company I worked for, questioning, whether, students are indeed writing their essays. And this is really something, if you do decide to engage in this field, this is something that you have to consider. And I'll talk about ways later on, ways to sort of evaluate companies to make sure that you're going somewhere and you're working somewhere that you feel comfortable working at. But it is very important to know that results are key. You do what needs to be done to get these results, and you may be asked to do things that you might not consider comfortable in a field like this. So like I said, consulting is not teaching except when it is. It's a related service. It's a different career path. It's something I won't harp on too much. If you have any questions, however, I do include my email address at the end. It's something I'm happy to talk with you about more one-on-one. So in terms of industry outlook and key questions, as I mentioned previously, there are over 300,000 Chinese students studying in America, and this appetite is not abating. There are more and more students looking to leave China to go to America or Britain or Australia. Some go to Japan, many of whom are looking to study abroad. The American numbers are still much higher than any other country. Now, because of this, there's also saturation of the market. I lived in Shanghai, I worked in Shanghai, and Shanghai is where you are going to find the most companies. Beijing tends to be number 2, and there is a growing sense of online work, creating, as I mentioned previously, a global network of consultants whereby you can become connected to students. Now, it's difficult to say exactly how many consultancies exist in these cities. As I mentioned previously, you may have these global established companies. You may have freelancers tackling a few students at a time. It's gotten to be that there are so many education companies in China that technically speaking, the Chinese government will not issue business licenses for them anymore. And many companies will obtain another license and work as an education company instead. I believe that the company I started may have been registered as a telecom company. Again, this is sort of the area where we definitely see this as gray and ambiguous by American standards, where in China, this is common practice. This is something that a lot of places do. Now, some key questions about engaging in this sort of work. looking at the industry, looking at the work. What are the pragmatic things? What are the skills needed to succeed in consulting roles? And what is life going to be like in the field? And then I include the philosophical questions. I've talked about, potential shadiness and whatnot. The question that I like to pose for people who are looking at this field is, does consulting prepare Chinese students to succeed in American universities? So the very first company that I worked for was a company called Taurus Education. I moved specifically to work for this company. I arrived in October of 2014. I had found the company through an informational interview with another alum, and I knew a bit about the company going in, but learned more definitely after I had landed in China. There was definitely more information to be had there than I received from the informational interview. What made Taurus unique was that it was an established company with a well-known founder. Taurus had been around for approximately 8 years by the time I arrived. The founder, which I did not know, has minor celebrity status in China. His name is Brian Ong. He has been on dating shows. He has an article in the Chinese version of Wikipedia, though I'm fairly confident that he asked a student to write that for him. That's definitely something. If you speak Chinese, you may be asked to do something like that sort of publicity work. And he worked exclusively with elite clientele. He had built up such a reputation that he had students looking to and having the scores to get into top 20 schools beating down his door. Within China itself, his name was more widely known and was better known than the name of the company itself. The structure of the company, we were structured as teams coalescing around a certain senior staff member. So I was on Brian's team. Brian had a few responsibilities as the co-founder of the company, but because he was very much a consultant through and through, that was the majority of his work. And as his team, and as a team of American consultants, that's what we worked on. So for most of my time there were 6 of us working under him. Our responsibilities as consultants reporting directly to Brian were brainstorming, editing the admissions essays for clarity to pull out the students' ideas. Essentially, the first few rounds of edits are not so much things like grammar and typing and things like that, but asking open-ended questions. What did you mean by this? How did this make you feel? Can you make this connection between this story and this experience to why you want to attend this university, or why you want to study in this field, why you want to conduct this research, things like that. And then we were also asked to provide information on school expertise. So given that I graduated from the University of Chicago, even if it were a student that I wasn't working with directly, I would tend to review things like the Chicago essay, or I would help students prepare for the Chicago interview. We would also be asked, and we would be told to learn specific things about each and every school. So usually there would be things like make sure to mention the Common Core when you're writing an essay for Chicago. Mentioning the Common Core is also something that tends to do well in Brown essays. We were encouraged to make sure that our students included mention of the core for Brown. For universities that would emphasize career advancement, we would talk about that. For universities that would emphasize volunteer work, nonprofit work, we would have our students emphasize that. So there was this sense of pulling in information that we had and doing research about the character and the reputation of each school and imparting this to our students to make sure that they included it in the essay to ensure that they seemed like they knew what the school was and why they wanted to go there. The work that we did usually was from 10 to 6:30, 5 to 6 days a week. We kept these hours in large part so students could come into the office. We had a physical office. I worked out of the Shanghai office. There were branch offices in 4 or 5 other cities. We kept these hours so that students could come in after school and they could write in the office. Or if they wanted to do interview prep, they could do it with us face-to-face at the end of the day in the office. The majority of our time was spent doing the edits for the essays. And here, quick turnaround was the goal. We would be asked to try to turn around a document, no matter how long. It could be a 12, 13-page essay, in 45 minutes. We would ask to do an entire supplement. We would do the entire University of California supplement in 45 minutes. So you really have to pick up these skills with copy editing, having a sense for voice, strong writing skills are an absolute must if you're going to be a consultant like this. And being able to turn out this work quickly is crucial. Overtime was very common nearer to deadlines. So there are, of course, the early decision to regular decision deadlines. As we approached these deadlines, depending on if our students had had regular output throughout the rest of the admission cycle, we would be required to work overtime. There were, one thing to definitely keep in mind is that many of these deadlines are very close to American holidays. We were very lucky the last Christmas that I was there. We were able to move through our students quickly enough that we had Christmas Eve and Christmas Day off. I know people who worked in the office on different teams till midnight on Christmas Eve. If you have a strong desire to have every American holiday off, this is probably not the industry for you. Now then, there's also definite downtime. There may be days where students are just not writing as much. You'll be in the office, essentially sitting at your computer, waiting for things to do. In Chinese companies, you do not ask for more work to do. It doesn't necessarily reflect well on your boss. So there were many days where I would come in, I would check my email, I would do a little reading. You definitely have to make sure that you look productive. If there are students in the office, they want to ensure that you look productive. But you don't necessarily go out to search for work if you don't have it. And this is especially true during the off season. So once people have their regular decisions especially, you might move into recruitment, though not a lot of consultants who work for established companies work with the marketing and the recruitment teams. These are usually reserved for Chinese staff. But there will be downtime where you might be able to travel, pursue other projects. Usually you'll have Chinese New Year off, so that will be a significant break there. And then I've talked about a few of the skills that you need to have. These skills for writing especially are very, very good. They need to be very good. Cross-cultural communication, being able to very simply convey the ideals and the necessity of an American education to a student in emails, because you deal a lot with email, or the few times you get to meet face-to-face are crucial. The way in which the team was set up, usually we only saw the student face-to-face if we were brainstorming or doing interviews. And the way the Taurus was set up was that technically because students chose to work with Brian, we were doing the essays, but we would not communicate directly with the student for the essays unless there were extenuating circumstances. Typically, we would send our work to Brian. Brian would send it off to make it seem like, or to ensure that parents were happy with the idea that Brian had been involved in the process, even if he didn't necessarily edit that particular draft or review that particular draft. So being flexible with that as well, very, very important. And a lesson I learned from that is, it's a very different model from the ways in which we work with our bosses in America. It is not necessarily a place where you as the underling will be welcome to give constructive criticism and feedback and ideas for evolving processes. Chinese companies are very often, and of course, many different companies, this will depend a lot on the company culture, the boss, etc. But my experience was that many companies, the structure of the company is your boss, the head of the company at the top or center. Everybody else radiates around. Things like job descriptions or whatnot are not binding. Really, your true job description is if your superior asks you to do it, you get it done. Now, my transition to the new company. So only a couple months after I moved to China, Brian called me into his office and told me that he had been planning for a long time to quit, start a new company, and wanted to know if I wanted to go too. I had just moved to China. I had been there for maybe a grand total of 2 months when we had this conversation. I didn't know most of the other team heads at the company, and I liked the way that he presented this new company. So 2 months after moving to work for Taurus split in half, and I went to work for the division that became MindImp and Bonday. Now, MindImp and Bonday are representative of a new type of consultancy that's really starting to appear in China. And this is sort of the combination education technology consulting company. And where Taurus built itself as very much, it built itself as a startup. It had been around for 8 years. This was truly my first real experience with a startup company. And one of the things that I learned was that a true startup company in China is going to be a combination of constant reinvention and that Chinese leadership model that I mentioned. So essentially, when we moved over, I was considered to be part of the founding team. It was Brian and that team of consultants that moved over together. There was initially more requests for input and feedback from us than there had been at Taurus, where processes were more established. But as reinvention happened, based on the ways that Brian envisioned the movement of the company, our input became less central to the way that we changed things and then became less asked for. This is something that, my American sensibility was very much, ideas, expansion, contribute, growth. This is not necessarily the best way to approach this sort of company culture, being able to adapt to that reality is something that's really useful for working in, truly any sort of company where you're engaging with a different culture. The responsibilities, again, very much follow the leader. We originally transitioned to a more traditional 9-to-5 model initially when we moved over to Mindem and Bondi. This changed as the company started to grow. There is a common phenomenon in Chinese culture where you do not go home until your boss goes home, even if you don't necessarily have more work to do. This is something that you may be asked to do, or if you are an international employee there, you may be absolved of that responsibility. So you may keep set hours, or you may be staying extra hours into the night, not necessarily doing much, but you're there until your boss leaves. This is definitely something that's possible, something to keep in mind. Now, the ways in which Mindem and Bondi were different from Taurus is that we focused a lot more on education. We devised these innovative reading programs where students were given access to American news stories so they could write about them and build critical inquiry and analysis skills. We built online courses teaching them about public speaking, writing, American history, many of the things that consulting tried to do but did not have, building up and closing that culture gap between what American students learn and do and what Chinese students learn and do. These more hybrid ed tech companies are really working on that. Bondi also became a mobile app, and the beginning of the mobile app was a library of largely American, though global summer programs, things like UChicago Summer Session. And this is a sense of activities rising. This focus on soft skills is starting to grow very slowly in China, but it's starting to grow and be seen as something that's beneficial for students to get through the admissions process. Activities are very much becoming that as well. Traditionally, Chinese students didn't do very many activities. They may participate in a volunteer project at school. A very common one among my students was that they would go to a mountain village to teach English, if they spoke a bit of English. Things that are more diverse, things that might be more familiar to us, running clubs, running volunteer projects, interning for nonprofit organizations are becoming more popular. And the mobile app was a way for Chinese students to get this information in the Chinese language, which is considered to be more trustworthy than English sources that students and parents may not be able to read well. Consulting was still there. Consulting is largely a way to make money, and it's a way to bring in students and to acclimate them to more academic and activity-focused work, because it is still such a new idea. Many parents need to be convinced that doing things like a summer volunteer project are more helpful than taking a third or fourth SAT prep class. So here, many of the skills from consulting still necessary, but also adaptability is absolutely key. Adaptability in all of the changes, all of the projects, being able to cross-communicate. These are the skills that I felt that I really learned and built up with Mindem and Bondi. Now, there also comes a time when you have to learn and realize that no matter how adaptable you are, opportunities with a certain place might end. So Mindem and Bondi were going through so many reinventions, and things were transitioning so far away from the original business model that brought us on that actually the entire original team, and I included, quit. So 3 of us decided to return to the more traditional consulting model, and we decided to go solo. We started our own company. Now, when you do this in China, I mentioned previously, you need a license. You may not be able to get one as an education company. I was very fortunate. One of my business partners was from Taiwan. She, of course, speaks Chinese. So this is something that she was able to spearhead for us. And she had connections enough within the industry that we were able to find a broker of sorts to help us get things like the license. I won't go into the licensing too much, but there are a few main things to know. We registered as a wholly foreign-owned company, meaning that we did not have one or more Chinese partners propping up the company. This is something where if you want full control over the way in which your company operates, this is what I would recommend. It's going to be the most expensive and the slowest license to get. Many companies, and ours included, technically worked illegally as we did this. My experience is that if you're good at what you do, parents don't care. So we were able to work the license. We actually had to go through 2 brokers because of an issue that took us about 6 months to get. 6 months to get. Once you have that, you can start issuing your own visas as well. China has been making its work permit visas and their requirements a lot more stringent. This is an industry that has a lot of new graduates, especially from top schools. Essentially, if you have a degree from a top school, you can probably get a job at least one type of consulting firm. But if you don't have 2 years of work experience outside of China, you technically can't get a work permit. Your company will probably give you a business visa. This is technically illegal. Fair warning, it's technically illegal. You're not allowed to work or make money on a business visa. Again, this is one of those gray areas. It happens. I did this for a while before I had my work permit, and while we were in between with the license. It is something that you sort of have to decide if you're willing to take the risk. Again, if this is something that people have questions about, I'm happy to answer them. In terms of other documents, you'll have a stamp for official documents. You'll have to make sure that you are paying taxes if you decide to do so. You know, there are a lot of different realities for going solo that you don't have to do if you work as a consultant for an established company. When I was working for Taurus, when I was working for Mindem and Bondi, I never had to deal with any of this stuff. These are things that you definitely learn as you go. Another thing that you will have to work on as you go, recruitment and partnerships. When you work for an established company, unless you specifically work on the marketing or the recruitment teams, which you might be pulled into as a foreign consultant, not necessarily common. Unless you are fluent in Chinese, some companies will use you in those regards. But you are on your own to find your own students. This means, you know, meeting parents, having lunches, holding seminars, canvassing, anything that you can do to build good word of mouth. Is necessary to, you know, really build that student base. And it can be slow going at first, but if you do good work, this is an industry that thrives by word of mouth. And these are definitely things to keep in mind as well. You need to have all of the skills that you had. If you would be working at an established company, you need to be able to, you know, be adaptable to the realities of, you know, being an entrepreneur. And you need to be ready. This is definitely something that was hard for me to learn. There are plenty of things that you can read online about the ups and downs of entrepreneurship. You know, the feelings of elation when something goes well, and the intense stress that can come when it feels like nothing is happening. You know, intellectualizing that and experiencing it are 2 very different things, especially if you're doing it in a foreign country where things are definitely different for you. So definitely think about that sort of thing. If you are not sure you are ready for that sort of challenge, listen to that gut feeling. Because the reality of being in a foreign country where you may not speak the language, trying to reach out to start your own company, it's definitely more jarring than, you know, the research that you can do. So we're going to come all the way back around to these key questions, now that I've given you sort of an overview of what a lot of these companies and things look like. So my key question was, does consulting help Chinese students? And I want to talk about a couple of things I have read before I answer that question. Very UChicago, I know. So according to one of China's largest overseas study bureaus. I believe they're affiliated with the government, but please don't quote me on that. I am not positive. 25% of all Chinese students accepted to Ivy League schools drop out. 25%. That is a significant number. And this is largely because of those cultural differences and because of English. Yes, students have to, have a good TOEFL score in order to get into schools. TOEFL does not necessarily map onto the ability to deal with academic English. And much like the SAT or the ACT, it is a test where one can learn test strategy. So a high score on TOEFL does not necessarily translate into, prodigious English skill in the classroom. Another piece, I didn't link it here, but I would definitely recommend that people to Google it and read it. The Economist has a piece called Alienation 101, and it's talking about the Chinese student population at the University of Iowa. And as the title implies, it talks about the ways in which these students are unable to integrate with the campus culture at large. And the result of all of this is the exact opposite of the benefits that we tend to think about when it comes to international students. We think of having international students in American classrooms as this amazing opportunity for cross-cultural communication, global thinking, higher learning, and the reality on many campuses is that these students are not confident about breaking through. The administration at these universities and the other students there don't have the skills, the capacity, or the drive to reach out to a Chinese student population. And the end result is that Chinese students especially, this is not just true for Chinese students, it's true for a lot of international students, but Chinese students especially will then group together. And the story, the article follows a few students around. Some of them talk about how they'll go entire days without speaking English, despite the fact that they are in America and in English language classrooms. Some will talk about how they only live with Chinese people, they only interact with Chinese people. So alienation is definitely a problem among, international students in general on American campuses and Chinese students in particular. So if you look at this, high dropout rate, lack of the benefit that we see, consulting, in theory, is supposed to help with these things. It's supposed to help put students in the right school and help prepare them for these realities. But given that consulting is so much about admissions and admissions results, and not yet so much about those academic soft skills or about, preparing for activities and the American way of life, that's not the goal yet. And that means that it's not necessarily the result of the work yet. Now, that may be a very pessimistic way of looking at it. I could also look and see that 75% of Ivy League Chinese students graduate. That's probably a lot lower than the general graduation rate if I were to compare. But statistics, there's a few ways to interpret, of course. But then I personally come back to the idea of the life of the mind mentality. What is strummed into us as students at the University of Chicago, or what drew us to the university and the idea of the university in the first place. This idea that education for education's sake is a very powerful and transformative thing. And here, I think, is where the variable happens. You could look at these statistics and say, no, consulting is not helping students. It's setting many of them up to fail. It's a flawed industry. It's something that I'm not comfortable working in. Or you can look at it and you can see the massive opportunity that is present and possible. If you have the writing skills, if you have the speaking skills, if you have the cross-cultural communication skills, if you have the entrepreneurial spirit, and if you have the drive to go to a foreign country and embed yourself in this industry, there are more than 300,000 potential young lives that can be dramatically changed for the better through the benefit of education. And when you think about it that way, it's a really powerful and a really magnificent thing. And I know this is a lot of, moral and philosophical things to put on a career, but I think that's one of the things that we need to think about when it comes to something like education. Is education consulting a career track, a paycheck, something that's truly meant just for advancement? Or do we work in education because we believe in that higher ideal? So you really need to ask yourself if that works for you. And if part of you says no, don't do it. Absolutely don't do it. That gut feeling is probably a very good one. Gut feelings are things that we should probably, as people, rely on more when it comes even to things like business and career. Listen to your inner self and what it has to say to you. Now, if you say, yes, this is perfect for whatever reason, either the paycheck or the ideals of education, if this is something that you want to be doing, then at this point, research and connections are going to be the things that are going to break you into the field. So here are some requirements, the ones I like to call the good, the bad, and the ugly. These are my own. There are so many consultants, they all have their own individual experience, but this is what I think you should do. I don't believe that you should move straight to China and try to start a company on your own. What you should do is start by working with an established consultancy. And here, really let your network be your guide. There are many alumni of the University of Chicago working in this field currently. I am sure any and all of them would be very willing to talk to each and every one of you about what their experience has been, what they would recommend. Really let that information dictate where you research, where you go, where you apply. Negotiate upon entry. If it's important to you that you get your work permit rather than a business visa, fight for that. If the money that you are being offered seems less than what other people said you should be making, fight for that. Definitely fight for your position right when you are there. It is much more difficult to do once you're sort of embedded in the company and in the system. The next thing that you want to do while you're at this established consultancy is you want to build name recognition. Now, this is something that's going to be a little difficult if you work in a place like Taurus, where you are working directly for somebody that has a lot of name recognition already. You want students to know who you are. You want students to know your good work. You want that information to get back to the parents. Because when and if you decide to leave and start your own company, or even if you decide to leave and go to a different company for more money, you want the option of those students and parents loving you and taking them with you. Because that is going to make, starting your next venture much easier. It seems very hostile takeover. This is a very common thing. Most of the partners at Taurus at the time that I was there had worked as senior consultants, took a bunch of students, left the company, went elsewhere, rose the ranks there, and were enticed back to Taurus with their partnerships, with their partner salaries, so long as they brought over X number of students. Being able to build that name recognition is going to be very useful for you. The way that I worked with Brian, it was really hard to do it. It sort of ensured my anonymity. You're definitely going to have to be proactive and possibly a little sneaky about how you do it. Like I said before, climb the ranks, break away. Use a consultancy, and this is where less ideals, definitely focus on the ideals of education with the students. But when it comes to your position and it comes to your ranking in the field, climb the ranks, break away when it's best for you to do so. Because it's such a boss-focused working culture, you will really need to take into your own hands the ways in which you want your reputation and your career to grow and change. This is also definitely something that should be long-term. Many people like to go, and my next bullet says this, like to go and teach. Teaching is an easy way to work part-time, make good money, and live in China. If living in China is your goal, you need to teach. You'll actually work less and make more at the outset if that is what you're doing. If you're really looking at this from a career perspective or really looking at it from an education access perspective, this is where consulting is going to be good for you. And really, keep in mind this idea of valuing education. Even after you have moved over, even after you have the job, let your conscience be your guide. Constantly be asking, is this the right industry? Are you engaging with it in the right way? Because that is going to ensure that not only are you, getting the career that you want to have out of all of this, but you are, giving the greatest benefit to all of these students and all of these parents who are investing. I mean, these students invest significant time, significant money over many years for English classes, TOEFL classes, SAT prep. Consulting is expensive. They might be spending 25, 30, 40,000 US dollars just to have you edit their applications. Definitely don't take that responsibility lightly. All right, and with that, so I know this is being recorded, but I would like to, just in case, turn over the discussion to Lucy. If you happen to have any questions that I can answer right now, let's go for it.
Sure. I actually, since I wasn't 100% sure that this would work, I didn't ask people to participate live, but I am prepared to ask some questions. At what age do students begin working with a consultant on average? Jason, did you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Sorry, mute button. My fault. User error. So this is a very good question, and this is one. This is one of those variables that's currently changing a bit within the industry. So the entire the core service of the consulting process is focused on the admission cycle. So typically we would sign students usually in the spring, and we would bring them in to begin working on things like their personal statement in the July and August before applications are going to be due. Because there are so many students and there is such a desire to get new students, that recruitment period is being pushed further and further back. These test prep initiatives, these academic initiatives, these activities initiatives are starting earlier and earlier in age in an attempt to bring in students sooner. Not every consultancy does this, but you may have one where you may have a kid who is as young as 8th or 9th grade who may come in for after-school English classes, and they may sign a contract that will then lock them in with that company through all of high school and through the admissions process. So this is something, if you're working for an established company, definitely ask what sort of students you'll be consistently working with. And if you're starting your own company, depending on the services that you want to provide, think about how early those services might be beneficial to students and when you actually want to start bringing them in.
Great, thanks. Is it your sense that most students from China who attend top-tier universities have used an education consulting firm?
I would say that and it's impossible for me to give a specific statistic, but I would say that a significant number probably do. And this is in part because of how few, once we get into the really top schools, how few tend to be accepted by American universities and just how cutthroat these admissions are. I worked with a kid while I was at Taurus who was vying for both Harvard and Yale, and he definitely had the test scores, he had the activities, he had the ability to do it. And when you work in a field like this and you're working with somebody who's very well connected, you learn a bit about the people who do the informational interviews and the admissions interviews. I worked with this kid on his Yale interview, and we were able to find out that he had an interviewer who was notorious for breaking down Chinese students, trying to find every quality that was, not of the Chinese education system, but to see if they have all of the American educational qualities to get this kid in. He did get in, and I believe he was only one of, I want to say 2 or 3 people from all of China accepted that year. He is a sweet kid, a very smart kid, but he did not have interview skills as we would look for them when he came into the process. And as somebody who also does interviews for University of Chicago admissions, we're stressed to not worry about style too much. But style can impede or enhance the ability of the student to convey what they want. So for many students who aren't prepared, the interview especially is a place where they can potentially fall flat. And if you're competing with 300 kids for 1 or 2 spots, the pressure is really intense. So I think especially as you get into the top 20, the number of students using consultants becomes significant.
Great. And that leads me to the next question. With such a limited number of spaces in top-tier schools, how do you encourage students and their parents to include 2nd or 3rd-tier schools in their list?
So for some, you don't. in all honesty, if they are of a certain caliber, then you usually don't. This was definitely different for me when I was working at Taurus versus when I was working for MindImp, Bondi, and for Ascend, my own company. Brian and Taurus had such a reputation for for excellence for top tier students at that point that we almost exclusively did top 20 schools. And when I say top 20, these students would apply to all 20. In fact, we had to stop them from trying to apply for more. So typically, if you are a top 20 student in China, you're applying for all 20, if your consultant is giving you the right advice. Now, once you move out of that range, it largely becomes a matter of perception. And this is something where you can try to be very convincing with statistics about, okay, so here's the median for what this school has in terms of SAT and GPA. That you can show concretely, though that information doesn't necessarily always work. If the student has an SAT score in range or not. You can try to discuss activities and things that may not go over well. That's a little more nebulous. Some parents are very in tune to the idea of, okay, I want my child to be in a school, and therefore they'll be a bit more malleable with their school list. We had a student who we technically did not work with. His mother really wanted him to work with us, but ultimately left the decision to the student. Something that's becoming a little more common, but is still rare. Usually parents are the decision makers here. He went to a top boarding school. He had good grades for, this will sound backhanded and complicated, but this is sort of the thing that you have to think about. He had good grades if he were an American student. He did not necessarily have good grades for a Chinese student. And whether we want to think about it or not, there really is internal competition between these Chinese students, and you really have to meet those standards. And he wanted to major in math. And in my opinion, any consultant worth their salt will not allow a Chinese student to apply for math or list it on their application. It's too common, it's too difficult to stand out. But this student was very focused on specific schools and very focused on the idea of math, even though he understood that what he wrote on his application in terms of major, he was not beholden to once he was accepted. He wasn't accepted to any of his American schools. He was accepted to a few other schools, but he wasn't accepted at all in America and chose to take a gap year to try again. Branding and identity are very much a thing in China. I had a few students that I ultimately did not work with who did not speak English except for the words Harvard and Yale. And you can sometimes come around to students and parents with the statistics and with the emotional appeal and mindset, but frankly it's still a gamble at this point. Sort of meeting the dream with the reality, and which parents are going to try to go for.
Gotcha. I actually worked in admissions at my alma mater, not an American university, in Montreal, and I read essays from Chinese students, and their essays and their test of English as a foreign language, TOEFL results, indicate that perhaps the students didn't quite write the essay. And you mentioned a little bit about this earlier on.
Yes.
How much tweaking would you say goes on in a reputable place versus an unreputable?
Absolutely. So Taurus was considered to be among the most reputable, if not the most reputable of, and again, I worry that this sounds backhanded or problematic, but of the Chinese run companies. And you will see differences in the way that things are operated depending on whether it is somebody from China who is running the company, if it's somebody who is running the company who is American educated, or if it is an international person who is educated in a Western style school. The sort of strategy that the consultancy has does vary a lot based upon who is running it. And as somebody who has worked a bit for every sort of company, you definitely do see these changes. It's one of those things that seems politically or socially or culturally insensitive to talk about, but there are definite realities to focus on there. And because of that, things like plagiarism differ depending on the type of company that you work for. I once was solicited to work for a company where I was essentially just going to be an essay writer. The Chinese consultant would send me an outline determined by that consultant and the student for a student I never met and would never meet, and I was tasked with writing essays based off of that outline. Of course, I did not take this job. Taurus was considered to be one of the most reputable companies, based on American standards in that way. And even then, there were times, not consistently, but there were definitely times where I edited to a level where I was not necessarily comfortable with. And what essentially that looked like there was we would usually go through about 6 revisions for every essay. This would wax or wane depending on time available and the output from the student. But essentially, at any point where it came time to stop getting student output, where it was clear that the student could not provide anymore, then the goal became give them the essay you want them to have. Sometimes you didn't have to do much of anything. They had excellent English. You were good to go. Sometimes it was polishing grammar. And sometimes there would be small areas, like definitely not the whole essay, but if a paragraph is poorly worded, you make it clearer. And these are things, it is the expectation that you are able and you're willing and you can do that. In China, this is not considered to be plagiarism. This is not considered to be problematic because A, it serves the ultimate goal of admissions, but they don't necessarily, and I've had this conversation with a couple students and a couple parents, they don't necessarily understand what we as admissions professionals glean from it. Many students and parents just see this as a writing sample. They don't necessarily understand the way in which we read between the lines to try to ascertain if this is a student of high intellectual ability who will be a good fit for, the way that we envision the culture of a different university. My opinion of good consultants is that they will try to impart that knowledge, and they will try to push the student in a way to write where they do not necessarily have to. The consultant doesn't have to, revise and polish and borderline plagiarize in that way. But that is not necessarily the goal of all consultancies or consultants.
Great, thank you. What are considered good results for a consultancy firm?
It's a good question. It's getting to be, especially if you are in a consultancy that works almost exclusively with top 20 schools, it's getting to be that if you get your kid into one school, that's successful. It's really starting to become that complicated and that hard to get kids into top tier universities. Some are easier than others. Admissions is, in a way subjective, so things will change year in and year out. I remember from the first year I started doing this to the second, there was a significant drop in Chicago students being accepted, for example. I don't think in my time, either working independently or with other people, I have ever gotten a kid into the undergraduate program at Stanford. I've done summer. Summer, of course, is a different thing. I could give a completely different talk on summer. But it is getting to be that if you get one kid into one school that his parents or her parents are happy with, you have succeeded. Parents, of course, want options, and Tier 2 and Tier 3, where there aren't necessarily as cutthroat admissions or as many Chinese students, there are a few more options for students there. But at this point, one acceptance letter is considered successful.
Great. How many students do you currently work with?
So I currently am part-time freelancing my consulting work. So I am working with, I'm mentally counting, it's not that many. Why is it so hard for me to count at this point? I should warn you, it's fairly late in Taipei, so I apologize for any loginess that may be coming through in the talk. I've got 2 currently that I'm working with, one going out, one coming in. One was just accepted to art school with a scholarship, which I personally am very proud of because not many Chinese students are offered funding in any way. You typically won't find a lot of students in need because the process in China is so expensive. So I'm very happy for that particular student. And I'm working a bit early on with a student who has not yet decided if they're applying this year or next year. Part of the recruitment process sometimes is doing a lot of work with no pay. So this is a student who's currently looking at internships, and I've been helping him look at potential options, work on a resume, and things like that. And then around that, I do freelance teaching as well, which again, I won't get into too much.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. I know it's very late, and just before you started, you put in a 9-hour workday. So I'm extremely grateful to you, Chason. So we are recording this. I'm going to be sending this out to everybody who signed up. And we had quite a few. I think we had over 60 something, 65 people sign up for this. And you've got your contact information. We really appreciate that. And just want to let everybody know that we're also doing another webinar tomorrow, July 19th, where alumna Dr. Ginny Kristerna will be holding up a mirror to our blind spots. You know what blind spots are, right? They're those pesky traits that others see in us, but we're kind of oblivious to. And every one of us has them, so it should be an interesting talk. Anyways, thank you so much, Chason. I really appreciate it, and thanks to everybody who signed up, and I hope you enjoy the presentation as much as I did. Bye, everybody. Bye, Chason.
Goodbye. Take care. Thank you again, everybody. And like Lucy said, please contact me if you have any questions or thoughts.